everyone. My name is Simona and I'm Sales and Partnerships Representative at Evolveum. And I would like to welcome you on Evolveum's partner webinar that will be led by our gold partner DAASI International from Germany. DAASI International is an expert in federated identity and access management with open source software. And as a gold Evolveum partner, they are engaged with various projects with MidPoint, which you can explore on DAASI's partner profile at Evolveum website. This webinar today will be dedicated to SCIM overlay for MidPoint, maintained by DAASI International, and you will hear about it from Sven Lukrafka, that will be talking about the topic, show you the architecture, configuration, and challenges during the implementation of the overlay. Now I would like to give words to Sven, as he will be taking over the presentation. Thank you, Sven, and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sven Lukrafka, and this presentation today will cover a SCIM overlay for MidPoint. We will talk about some topics. First, I want to start with an introduction covering the scope of the overlay and the motivation behind it. Then we hand over to the configuration. I want to show you some demo, like some hands-on, a few requests against the overlay so that you can see what you can expect and how the overlay will behave. After that, I will talk about some challenges we had during the implementation. Then we go over to some limitations the overlay in its current status has, and we finish with a conclusion. So the overlay is implemented as a SCIM2 web service. This means that it's like the regular web service used from MidPoint, behind the same endpoints or behind the same general endpoint, so you can access it via localhost 8080 and then /midpoint/ws/services, and the overlay is then behind the /SCIM2 endpoint. The current version of the overlay works with version 4.4.6, so the LTS version of MidPoint. But we definitely plan on updating it always to the latest LTS version. So this would be 4.8. You can expect supported methods like get, put, post, delete, and patch, like you would expect from any other regular REST API. We did not implement all the endpoints the SCIM provides. But so that you have an overview, here is a list of the endpoints you can expect from the overlay. Basically, we start with a general request. So with the /users, so you call /SCIM2/users, there you will retrieve all the users available in MidPoint. So every identity, every user in MidPoint is requested, transformed to SCIM, and then returned as a response to your SCIM request. But that's like, you don't always want to have all the users at once. You probably want to use some kind of filter, and that's for the second endpoint. So you are able to provide an option to this /users endpoint, and that will be the filter option. So this is a actual SCIM filter, so it has some kind of requirements according to syntax. These requirements are defined in the RFC 7644, which is the general SCIM RFC. So when you are unsure what you can expect from SCIM, what kind of syntax is used, you can always have a look there. So I really recommend it for you to have a look if you are interested in SCIM and are not sure about some kind of implementations or some kind of behavior. Have a look there. It's very well documented. So yeah, if you have a look there, you will see that the SCIM filter is also defined there, like the specifications. So if you are unsure about how to build a SCIM filter, what you can use and what not, just go there. Then we have another endpoint which is more specific. So here you can provide an OID, so an identifier, which will then result in retrieving only one single user object. The OID is the same OID which MidPoint uses as an identifier for their internal objects, for their objects. So if you check out one of your identities, for example, the XML version of it, and have a look for the OID. That's exactly the OID which is required here. Then we have the /me endpoint. This one gives you information about the authenticated user. So the endpoints of the SCIM overlay are protected with basic auth, so you have to provide some kind of authentication. And if you just want to get information about, let's say, yourself as being the authenticated user, you can call the /me endpoint. The result will be the same as if you call /users/OID with your OID or the OID of your object, which represents you in MidPoint. Then we have the endpoint /resources/user. This is basically an information endpoint. It gives you some kind of information about what to expect from the resource type user. So in general, in SCIM, we have different resource types as you would expect from MidPoint as well. So for example, in MidPoint, we have users, we have roles. And that's the same with SCIM. Here, so far, it's the /user. So you can get information about the resource type user. This, for example, tells you which kind of extensions are available, which kind of namespaces, SCIM namespaces are present for the resource type user, and what kind of restrictions or other kind of configuration has been done for the user resource type. And if you then go a little bit deeper, you have the /schemas endpoint. This one gives you information about the accepted schema. So the user resource consists of different kind of attributes. And to know what kind of attributes you can expect from these resource type, you can call this /schemas endpoint, and this one will provide you a whole list of all attributes which are part of the schemas, the resource types. All right, then let's talk a little bit about the motivation. So why did we start in implementing such an overlay? This all started with a client request we had. And the client requested for a standard REST API interface. So he wanted a REST API interface, which you would say, okay, MidPoint is already providing, but he wanted to have, following it, a standard, like a defined standard, which is commonly used across the internet, which then can be also used by other components. So the client has other external components. They use all the same standardized interface, and the idea is that MidPoint should also provide an interface for the standard in order to connect these components. The second motivation was then user interaction, so that you can modify user objects in MidPoint, not via the MidPoint GUI, but via another GUI using a standardized REST API interface. In this example, a SCIM front end, and the idea is that you can have any kind of front end which implements or uses the SCIM standard, can then be easily connected via this overlay to MidPoint. So you're not limited to one specific front end or one kind of optical implementation, but you can exchange them very easily as far as they implement the SCIM REST API interface, or better say, the SCIM standard. In our example, we implemented something like that, especially for self-service, so that a user can log in via this front end and can change his own attributes, his own parameters. One other part, or one idea which comes into mind when you think about implementing such thing, is that you ask yourself, why is it not a proxy? Why is it as an overlay? Because it would also be possible, and we had a lot of thoughts about that, to implement this whole thing as a proxy, so that you have a proxy server who does the translation between SCIM and MidPoint XML, or MidPoint REST API, and does that from SCIM front end to MidPoint REST API and vice versa. But we decided not to go with a proxy because we were not sure about performance in this case. So one of the requirements was that it has to be highly performant, and we had concerns that this would not be fulfilled with a proxy, because you always have kind of like, it's only a small amount of time, but you always have this additional amount of time which needs to be done, that a proxy creates another connection to MidPoint, creates another connection to the front end, and so on. So this is always some like little bit of additional time which was needed, and we weren't sure about how much time this will be. So we decided to skip that idea and directly implement it as an overlay. So if you're in a position where you already like downloaded the overlay, build it, and now are ready to use it, before that you have to configure it. So we will go a little bit over the configuration and talk about how you can configure the actual overlay. We had also some thoughts about that and wanted to stick to existing MidPoint configuration mechanisms. So this would be either using configuration XML objects, or like configuration stored in the database, or using the config XML, which is stored in the MidPoint home directory. In the end, we decided for that because our idea was that the overlay is quite static in its should be quite static in its behavior. So you want to have a fixed configuration which is not easily to change, and which should be static over the duration of running MidPoint. Of course, after restart you can change configuration here, but we want to keep it static. So we decided for config to use the config XML. So you have the existing MidPoint configuration in this config file, and you can just add the additional configuration for this overlay in the same file. So let's get over the different configuration parameters. The first one is the namespace. This one specifies the custom attribute schema. So if you use extension attributes in MidPoint, you're already aware of the fact that you need to define an additional namespace for these custom attributes, which are not default. And in order for the overlay to actually find the correct custom attributes you want to use with your overlay, and in order to have the correct references, you need to define this namespace in the configuration of the overlay. Kind of same is true for the SCIM namespace parameter. This one defines the namespace for additional or custom SCIM attributes. So if you have custom attributes in MidPoint, you also have to define, most of the time you have to define custom attributes in SCIM and define this in a separate namespace. So in this kind of structure, they are quite similar, so SCIM and MidPoint. We have defined for both of these parameters, we defined the default, which you can see here. So it's either example.com or the schemas extension for SCIM. SCIM also defines default attributes. So this will also be only required for the additional attributes which are not part of the default. Which attributes are default and which are not is also something you can find in the RFC I mentioned earlier. Then we have the identifier regex. This one is actually there in order to be able to define an additional identifier for your user or for your requests. So earlier we talked a little bit about an endpoint under /users/OID. This one actually requires an identifier, the OID, and in the overlay we implemented a feature that you can define an additional identifier, which will also then be able to use as identifier. You have to define here in the identifier regular expression, you have to define a regular expression which actually determines what kind of structure or what kind of type this additional identifier is. And then in the configuration, in the attribute configuration, you also have to define that this attribute is used as identifier. But we will come to that later. Then we have the base URI. This one basically covers a specific behavior for SCIM. So when you have a SCIM request and expect a result in SCIM, the part of this result will always be an attribute or parameter called location. And this location actually is an URL which defines where you can find the object you just requested or which was just returned. So this one might be not that relevant if you just got one object, if you have a very a request with an identifier, but this one is relevant. For example, searches. If you search for a high amount of objects and you get, for example, 20 objects, each of these 20 objects will get this location attribute. And in this location attribute, you see the URL under which you can find information about the specific object. So in order for the overlay to build the correct location attribute, you have to provide the base URL of MidPoint, how it is currently running. Then the overlay also supports paging. So we have the next two parameters will target the behavior for paging. When you fulfill a request or you execute a request against a SCIM overlay, you can define a result size which should be returned. So how many objects do you want to have per request? And if you don't define any kind of result size in your request, a default amount will be returned, and this is exactly the amount you can specify here. The next attribute is the max result size. This one is quite close to it. This one is basically like a safety net, so that the overlay will never return too many objects at once. So, because you can imagine that if you fulfill a request against the overlay, and this one, that you have, for example, 100,000 users in MidPoint, and the overlay tries to get all the 100,000 objects, tries to transform them, and then return as a single response to your request, this will be highly inefficient. So you basically should use paging, and you should not request too many objects at once in order to have a performant behavior. So that's why we implemented a feature called max result size, where we limit the maximum amount of objects you can retrieve at once. You can adjust that if you want. The default is 1,000. So normally you are not needed to adjust that, because 1,000 is already quite a lot. If you specify a number which is higher than the max result size in your request, then the server will deny your request. It will just call it as invalid and will not give you any response to that. Then we come to the attribute mapping, which is probably quite the most important part of the configuration, because it links SCIM attributes to MidPoint attributes. The attribute mapping consists of several map entries. Each of the map entries contains 4 parameters, and these 4 parameters define the mapping for a single attribute pair between SCIM and MidPoint. So if you, for example, want to have 5 SCIM attributes, you will have to define 5 mapping entries, each for one single SCIM attribute. The 4 parameters inside this map entries are SCIM, which actually defines the attribute with the SCIM namespace. So you have to define if it's a default attribute, use the default SCIM namespace and the attribute name, and if it's an extension attribute, you have to define the extension namespace and so on. Then you define the midpoint, the parameters midpoint, which defines the midpoint attribute with namespace. So exactly the same, use whatever namespace is necessary for this attribute and the attribute name as well. Then you can define whether to use it as identifier or not. So this is exactly what I mentioned earlier. If you want to use an additional identifier in your request, you have to specify this for the attribute as well, and this would be the place to do so. This can only be true for one element, so we only support one additional identifier, so you can have a maximum of 2, not more. Then we also have a parameter which is called isUnique. This one basically defines whether this attribute is unique in the database or not. This one is only there in order to improve search performance, because you can search a little bit differently for unique attributes than for regular attributes. And this will not kind of do with any kind of check for write operations. So if you create a new entry via the SCIM overlay and you defined in your mapping one attribute as unique, and this is not the case because of your request, there's no check which will be executed here. So this is only for search operations in order to improve them. It's not for write operations or any kind of thing like that, or patch operations. So then I want to show you an example how it can look like. So what you should do. This one is an example config XML. So you see the key store at the top, and under that you can just put your SCIM2 service configuration, but actually you can place it wherever you want inside the config XML. So we have the default result size, max result size, and so on. So all the configuration attributes we just talked about. All right, then let me do a quick hands-on so that you have some kind of an idea what to expect from the overlay. Let me quickly change the screen. So I actually want to show you some configuration examples in Postman. So we will just do some requests against the overlay, which is at the moment running at my local machine. So let's start with the resource types endpoint. So as you can see here, we go to the SCIM2/resource types/user endpoint, and in return we retrieve this kind of information. So the most important part here is actually this part with schema extensions, which gives you a list of all the schema extensions which are defined for this resource type, which is like the most relevant part of this endpoint, or the most relevant information you retrieve here. So this one defines what kind of extension namespaces you can expect for this resource type, and whether they are required or not. They also define the regular schema, the endpoint in general, and some description and ID and so on. So these are quite basic information. So if you then want to get some information about existing users in MidPoint, you can go to the endpoint with SCIM2/users. You will again get the resources attribute, and inside the resources attribute you get a list of all the objects you retrieved by your request. And you see here we have also total results, which is one of the paging attributes, which you already get returned by default. So let's have a look at one single resource. So here we have the schema of this resource. So it's a user object, and this user object does not contain any extension attributes, either because none is set, or because we did not define any extension namespaces, extension schemas for resource type user. Then we have some of the attributes we defined. We have the username. So this, what you can see here, is just the configuration I just showed you in action. So there are only two mappings inside this configuration, for username and for name, for the formatted name. So we only get two attributes in our response. This first one is username, which was mapped to the naming attribute. And the second one was name.formatted, which was mapped to the full name. So these are the two values from MidPoint we get in our SCIM mapping. In addition to that, we also have meta information. This one also contains the resource type once more, the creation date from MidPoint, the last modified date also from MidPoint, then the attribute location, which we talked earlier about, and the version. This one is the version in the database, so what kind of version this object has. So the same is true. It looks quite the same for the second object. And in the end, we have the other two attributes for the paging. So we have start index, items per page, and total results. So total results will actually tell you how many objects in total you can expect. Start index will tell you at what page of your paging you are at the moment, so at what object you are starting with. And we have items per page, so how many objects you will retrieve per paging. So if you have only 2 objects in total, you have, of course, only 2 items per page, because that's your total return. We can then have a look at one specific user. So this time I copied the OID from this specific user and pasted in the URL. And then it looks quite the same, just that we don't have a list response as in the user's endpoint, but now we have only the user object as a return object. So the other attributes and information from this are exactly the same. So we then can use a filter, and we probably, in this case, we will use a filter which searches for objects which have a username containing an A. So we use the SCIM attribute. Then we can have a contains, like CO for contains, and we want to contain it an A. If we execute this request, we see that it will have 2 results because both of our example users contain username with an A. So we see here administrator contains an A, and username ABC also contains an E. And last but not least, I want to talk about the schema endpoint. So this is also quite interesting. Here you can actually get information about the schema. So what kind of attributes are supported by the schema and what you can expect from your SCIM request. So in this case, it's not too complex because we did only define 2 SCIM attributes. The first one is name.formatted. So this is actually a complex attribute. So we have the name attribute, which then will contain another attribute. So you will see that quite often in SCIM, that you have complex attributes which do not consist of a single value, but contain of another attribute or of a more complex information. So this is name.formatted, and the second one, which is not a complex attribute, is just the username. So here you can see this one is type string, this one is type complex, and inside type complex you see type string. So yeah, the one is a complex attribute, the other one is not, and you also see additional information about this attribute. So for example, if it's required, if it's multi-valued, and so on. So then the other also supported the other operations. So we have also a post where you can create users, which will just be a post on the /users endpoint, where you have to define at least the SCIM attribute, which is mapped to the naming attribute. As you know, you cannot create an object without a name in MidPoint. So you have to define at least one mapping for the naming attribute and provide that for your GET request and for your POST request. Then we can also execute a modification. So if we want to modify attributes in MidPoint via the SCIM overlay, we can stick to the syntax which the SCIM provides in order to write patch operations. So we have here the operations section where you can define multiple operations. Each operation contains of like the type of operations. It's a replace, the path to the attribute, and the value you actually want to have as a new value. In the end, we also have the delete. So here you can specify an OID, and with the delete, with a delete request against this endpoint, you will delete the object with this specific OID. All right, then let's get back to the presentation. and continue with the challenges. So during the implementation, we had some challenges. One of the main challenges definitely was the transformation of data structure, because as you can imagine, SCIM has a quite, in some parts, has a quite different data structure than MidPoint, especially if you want to transform it from one to another. And both ways, you have to find some kind of tweaks in order to get this transformation done in a consistent kind of way. So one of the challenges in transformation was primary mail and phone number. So in like it's also primary phone number, you can define both in SCIM. So the idea is actually that in SCIM you can provide several emails, several values for email, and you can mark one of them as primary, so as your main email address, but they will all be stored or will all be handled as the same attribute. And this will make it a little bit difficult because MidPoint is not aware of this concept, and we had to find some kind of workaround here. Our idea was then in the configuration, you can define an attribute which is called additional email attribute, which is a MidPoint attribute. And this will result in the behavior that if you work with primary mail and regular mail, one will stored in the regular email attribute, so the one you defined in your SCIM mapping, and the one which is marked as primary will be stored in the additional email attribute. So our approach here was that we have two attributes and stored in two separate attributes. Another thing was multi versus single value. So we have some attributes which are defined as multi-value by the SCIM schema, and a single value by MidPoint schema, and the other way around. So you have to kind of find your way in how to deal with that. So our idea here was to stick mainly with the SCIM schema. So if you define one of the SCIM attributes as multi-value, we will then try to transform it to MidPoint, and if MidPoint then returns, okay, it's only a single value in my schema, you will get an error. For the other way around, it's not a big problem because you can have a single value easily transformed to a multi-value in SCIM. Another part was the SCIM filter. So basically, when we started, we worked with the MidPoint query API. And this query API is a little bit different than the way how SCIM filters are defined. And the biggest challenge here was to keep it performant, because the transformation of SCIM filters to query API filters is quite a complex thing, and so this can take some time. And we want to have performant filters, so especially performant MidPoint filters. So if someone enters a SCIM filter, we want to transform it as an performant MidPoint filter as possible, and this requires some extra work. But in the end, I think we found quite a good approach. The third challenge was complex SCIM attributes. So as we talked earlier about the kind of or the behavior in SCIM, that you have complex attributes. So you have an attribute which contains of several more attributes and then are marked as complex. Our idea was then to kind of have an implementation or have an approach which SCIM always already provides. And this is the dotted path. So you can write the path to one specific attribute, even if it's inside a complex attribute by dots. So you, for example, for the formatted attribute, you can provide something like name.formatted, and by that define that this, you mean the actual formatted attribute inside the complex attribute name, and can then have, again, direct matchings or direct mappings between SCIM attribute and MidPoint attributes, even if the SCIM attribute is part of a complex attribute structure. Then let's talk about some limitations, because we started the implementation of this overlay, but it's not yet finished. We have some plans and some ideas, but we are also aware of some limitations the overlay has in its current version, and we don't want to keep them from you. So one of the limitations is that it's, so far only the user's resource type is supported. So for now, we can only use users as a resource type. This one will not require too much work to extend it, but that's the current status. Then we started the implementation of the overlay when there was only basic auth supported in MidPoint. So this was our approach as well. In the meanwhile, there had been some changes, and now you can have a various amount of authentication methods with MidPoint, but still the overlay only supports basic auth. So you have to provide a username and a password in order to interact with the overlay. And we have some limitations in search filters. As I talked earlier, that the transformation from SCIM to MidPoint queries is quite complex, and in our tests and in our work with the overlay, we experienced some filters which are quite unperformant. So these ones are, for example, complex searches where you have a lot of or and ands, so like connected different search parameters. So if you do that in a quite excessive way, you will have quite slow searches, because this one will take some time and it's not the most performant thing. We also did not implement grouping as a complex attribute filter, and searching against multi-value attributes with contains or equal result in undetermined behavior. So if you have multi-valued attributes and you use these filter searches, you will have not quite fixed results in what you will retrieve from the overlay. Okay, so how can you test it? Basically, you can check out the GitLab from DAASI under /midpoint/SCIM MidPoint SCIM overlay. You can find the overlay. You're very welcome to check it out and build it with Maven clean install, and then work with it all by yourself. You will also find the complete documentation of that overlay in the README file of the project. And we have some further plans with it. So we want to support more data types like groups and organizations to support like at least all the data types which are part of MidPoint. But as you can imagine, you could imagine like that you want to have more data types to work with it. So you're not limited to only the 4 data types which MidPoint provides, but there could be also more like SCIM data types. Then we want to implement bulk operations so that you can modify a big amount of object at once. And we want to support endpoints for password reset so that you can trigger and work with password reset over the overlay and self-registration. Both are like part of self-service, but we want to support them in the future, so to extend the self-service capabilities of the overlay. So if you're a developer, you're also very welcome to fulfill merge requests against the repository. So if you want to work with us on the overlay and want to improve the quality of the overlay, you are very welcome to provide any kind of merge requests. All right, then thank you very much for your attention.